The actual definition of capitalism is a system where production is organized for profit, where the centers of economic power are privately owned, and they operate in order to maximize the return on the investment of those who own them. Production organized for profit. That's what capitalism is. And capitalism, the economic system of capitalism, has gone through 4 stages. And we're in the 4th stage of capitalism. And we're going to talk about what those 4 stages are. The first stage of capitalism is what's called primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation. And that, it's important to talk about primitive accumulation because what we're told is that the richest of the rich, right? The billionaires, the monopolists, the people that run the world, well, they're there because they worked really, really hard, right? They just worked so much harder than everybody else. Well, primitive accumulation, the origins of capitalism, reveals that capitalism began with mass theft. And that theft started in Europe. Anyone ever watch Robin Hood? What is Robin Hood? What's his origin? Why is he an outlaw, right? He killed the king's deer, right? That's enclosure, right? Privatization, kicking the peasants off the land, turning them into renters who have to pay rents. And, King Henry VIII, he was the last king of England named Henry. And there's never been another king of England named Henry after King Henry VIII. And it wasn't because of his 6 wives. It was because of the fact that he was quite brutal in the privatization. And that he made it a crime to be homeless. And there were, tens of thousands of people who were hung for being vagabonds, being homeless. And as they kicked the peasants off the land, all kinds of people were being executed. I have ancestors from Ireland and Scotland. And in Scotland, there was the Jacobite uprising that happened. The Scottish, feudal system, Roman Catholic, fought against the English system that was moving towards capitalism. And they lost the Jacobite uprising. And then there was a genocide, the clearing of the Highlands, where they drove all the Scottish Highlanders out and killed them in mass. And actually, it's funny, you love your Appalachian music, right? There's an old Appalachian song, and I would hear it when I was a kid, like, over the river to feed my sheep, over the river, they're singing about Bonnie Prince Charlie, the leader of the Jacobite uprising, right? The guy who claimed he was the leader in trying to hold on to feudalism and become the king of England. It was the Jacobites, and they rallied around King Charles, who was, had fled to France and was trying to claim to be the king, and there was a whole fight there. But after the Jacobite uprising, there was genocide in Scotland, and they cleared the Scottish Highlands and privatized the land. And Glasgow, that's where Adam Smith, the economist, he was based in Glasgow, and as the capitalist system started expanding into Scotland as they cleared out feudalism. And that obviously, then we know that there was also the seizing of different parts of the world. Africa, South America, and the Americas, right? And Asia, big chunks of Asia. They started colonizing the world. And the colonialism brought a huge amount of wealth into Europe. And it was the wealth of colonialism and the exploitation of the African people, the seizure of new territories, mass theft, and murder and genocide that laid the basis for modern capitalism. So when people say, socialism is theft, it's like capitalism began with the greatest mass theft in history. And also when people give you a body count, communism killed a gajillion people, it's like you do realize that capitalism just to begin had to kill millions of people in the transatlantic slave trade, millions of Native Americans, millions of people in various colonized places, millions of people even in the homelands, clearing the commons, etc. That's what laid the basis for the modern Western system, right? That it is based on colonialism. And that's what makes a really big difference between, the new economy that's rising in the world today and the Western system, is that Russia and China, they got to be wealthy countries without primitive accumulation. China was able to lift itself up without going all over the world and killing millions of people and impoverishing them and bringing the wealth back to China in order to make China wealthy. Russia was able to build itself up without going all over the world and killing millions of people and impoverishing them in order to make Russia a strong country. And there's a fundamental difference between the new superpowers and the new economy that's arising in the world and the Western system centered around Wall Street and London, which is that the Western system is based on colonialism, and that's an important thing. And you want to get spiritual about this. When I was in Iran, I learned that in Shia Islam, they have a particular interpretation. In Islam, they talk about haram. It means sin, right? That if you sin, right? If you do something, but they argue that that sin corrupts things, haram corrupts things, right? That if you steal food and you eat it, it might make you sick, right? If you buy a house and the loan that you get to buy your house doesn't follow the Islamic law, that house might be dangerous, it might catch on fire. The idea is that if something is acquired in an impure way, it is corrupted. And in the legal system, they talk about fruit of a poison tree. That's a legal term. If the police search your house without a warrant, what they find is inadmissible because it was acquired in an impure way. And that there's a corruption. And when we talk about what's going on in America right now, when we talk about the spiritual problem that we're seeing all over the country of people not knowing who they are and the suicide rate and drug addiction, we can't separate it from primitive accumulation. We can't separate it from the fact that there is a spiritual curse hanging over America. And I would argue that wokeism, right? Wokeism is all about changing the words. Wokeism is all about call-out culture. I would argue that that's some kind of weird attempt. They think that if they say the magic words, they can make the curse go away, right? If we just say systemic racism, if we just use the right pronouns, we can make this curse go away. Well, you can't make the curse go away with words. The economic foundations have to be changed. But the economic foundations are primitive accumulation. After primitive accumulation, you got the stage of industrialization. Industrial capitalism. And that's when you have factory owners and factory workers. And that's the system that emerged with, you talk about sweatshops, you talk about steel mills, you talk about factory production. But something unique happened when we entered the stage of industrialization, something that had never happened before, which is poverty created by wealth. Poverty created by abundance. No system in the past had ever had that. In previous systems, when people were homeless, it's because there wasn't enough housing. When people were hungry, it was because there were shortages of food. But it was only with the rise of industrial capitalism that we had a problem of poverty created by abundance. Poverty created by having too much wealth. People becoming homeless because there are too many houses. People becoming hungry because there's too much food. That doesn't make any rational sense. But it happens because you have production organized for profit. So I'll explain here. Imagine you have a factory and you're making tires. Or I don't know, let's do it. I always do tires. Let's do a different product. Shoes. They're doing shoes, right? You have a product making shoes. In order to make your shoes, you're going to need the supplies to make it, the leather, the etc. So that's A. And on top of that, you're going to need to ship the shoes to the stores where they're being sold, right? So the shipping, the transportation, that's B. And then obviously you're going to need labor power, human beings, to assemble those shoes, right? And that's C. And then the final cost of the product is D. Now, what's the problem? Well, how does the owner, who organized the whole thing and put up the money, how does he make a profit? He has to make a profit. He can't cut into the shipping costs, and he can't cut into the material costs. So the profit that the owner is making on each product is extracted from the labor power. And this is when they talk about surplus value. They talk about exploitation, right? He's cutting into the labor value that the worker puts into it. And so it's really C1 and C2. And generally people look at this and they say that this is unfair. But they're missing an important point, because it's not only unfair, there's a built-in problem with this, which is C1 is what the worker actually gets paid. That's the wages paid out. C2 is the profit of the employer. C1 is always going to be less than D. The amount of wages paid out in the process of creating a product are never enough to buy back the products that are produced. You always have more products created than you have wages paid out. And that's what they call glut. Economists refer to that as glut, G-L-U-T. And there's many examples of how we deal with this ever-present problem of glut in our economy. For example, I always talk about how there is, at this point in Missouri, go to Springfield, Missouri, there's a cave. And in that cave there are billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of cheese that is buried there. Why? That's the U.S. Department of Agriculture trying to keep the farms from going out of business, because they buy this cheese and they bury it in a cave to make the price of dairy go up, right? And the military-industrial complex. Why is it our government is constantly spending huge amounts of money on weapons and bombs that will hopefully never be used? Well, that's because that keeps the economy rolling. It's a subsidy, right? Food stamps, a great example. Food stamps It keeps the food business going, right? It's a way to keep people buying food even when they can't afford it. And that there's constantly this problem of poverty created by abundance. And the more efficient production becomes, the bigger this problem is. And there's another aspect of this which is important to understand, which is that the owner, right, he's trying to make as many products as he possibly can, but he wants to pay as little as he possibly can to create it. So he's constantly inventing labor-saving technology, right? And this is a big aspect of what we're living under right now, labor-saving technology. Replace workers with machines, or make the workers that you do hire easier to replace, de-skill the jobs so you can pay a lot less, it's a lot easier to retrain workers. So as you're doing that, C, the amount of labor power that goes into the process of production, is going down. Here's the problem. As C decreases, as the amount of labor power involved in production decreases, the profit is extracted from the labor power. So the rate of profit that the owner makes also goes down. So as the role of the worker in production goes down, the rate of profit that the owner is making on each item goes down. So in order to make up for the fact that he's making less and less of a profit on each item, he has to churn out even more products. And that this is an ongoing thing. And this is the law of production organized for profit. That you constantly have gluts on the market. You constantly have this problem of too many products leading to mass unemployment, poverty created by abundance. And generally, you have a big economic crisis following a great technological leap. When you have a great technological leap, it leads to a huge economic crisis. We look at the fact that World War I came after many great technological innovations, etc. World War II came about really as a result of Henry Ford and his great innovations on the assembly line. We were producing radios and refrigerators and products better than ever before, and it made the economy crash. And the reason we're in a prolonged economic crisis right now, and they can't solve it, is because of the fact that we're living in the aftermath of one of the greatest technological leaps. You look at what AI can do. You look at the computer revolution. You look at 3D printers. This is all leading to a situation where it is easier than ever to produce products, but our buyback ability is lower. There's no room for us at the assembly line, and the amount of wages paid out in production is lower than ever before. And that is the root of the economic crisis that we're living in. Self-driving cars. Why in the world should self-driving cars be a bad thing? It's a great thing, self-driving cars. Think about it. The idea that this job called driving would no longer be necessary, that should be great. But Andrew Yang has pointed out that if we had self-driving cars in America, you'd have millions of unemployed truck drivers, you'd have millions of unemployed Uber drivers, you'd have traffic courts shut down. It would be an economic disaster. That does not make sense. We should not have a situation where technological progress and greater ability to produce wealth and abundance leads to more poverty. And that is something that became very apparent during the period of industrialization. Now, industrialization led to these problems of overproduction.
Here's what Karl Marx had to say about overproduction. In 1848, quote, "In these crises there breaks out an epidemic that in all earlier epochs would have seemed an absurdity, the epidemic of overproduction. Society suddenly finds itself put back into a state of momentary barbarism. It appears as if a famine, a universal war of devastation, had cut off the supply of every means of subsistence. Industry and commerce seem to be destroyed. And why? Because there is too much civilization, too much means of subsistence, too much industry, too much commerce? And how does the bourgeoisie get over these crises? On the one hand, by enforced destruction of a mass of productive forces, on the other, by the conquest of new markets and by the more thorough exploitation of the old ones. That is to say, by paving the way for more extensive and more destructive crises, and by diminishing the means whereby crises are prevented." End quote.